Debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Monday, joined by Dizon, who is going to continue to go through some issues with the Quran. Specifically, we are going over examining Muslim arguments for the Quran, part 2. We already did a part 1. We're going to examine those arguments that they use for the Quran and, of course, offer some responses from a Catholic perspective. Welcome back to the show, Lewis. How are you?
I'm doing great. Excited to be back. I've been very busy doing a lot of research, not just for this, but also for a bunch of PhD-related stuff. But it's all interrelated. It's all generally in the topic of Christian-Muslim interactions. So you can say that I'm, boning up on that field so that I could tackle it from every possible angle, you could say.
Well, it's helpful that it ties in together, so it makes it a little bit easier on you.
Yep, for sure. Plus, I know that it's good to have a little niche that you can fill. I know in these Catholic circles, there's a lot of focus on stuff like inter-church squabbles or arguing with other Christian groups like Catholics and Orthodox. But I do think we need to step up our game with responding to non-Christian groups set as Muslims. So I'm happy to do that as part of the show.
Yeah, looking forward to it. I think you have a presentation too that you're going to show.
Yep. Yeah. So let me just grab the PowerPoint and it should be ready to go.
Okay.
And let me know. Oh, there it is. So this is part 2 of examining Muslim arguments for the Quran. The 2 parts are standalone, so if anyone has not watched part 1 yet, it's okay. You're not necessarily going to get lost with this one, although I do recommend watching the first part as well. They tackle different sets of arguments, but they're all somewhat related to each other. So just to give you a recap, in part 1, we were looking at what are termed arguments from literary excellence. This is stuff like linguistic miracles, numerical miracles, and as well as the so-called aesthetic appeal of the Quran. And I mentioned that there's a part 2, which is this one, and we're going to be tackling what I call arguments from supernatural knowledge. This would include stuff like knowledge of scientific phenomena, knowledge of future events, so prophecy, as well as knowledge of biblical lore. The idea behind these arguments is that the Quran displays knowledge of things that the author would not have known if he was just relying on his own fallible human knowledge, and therefore this must all be from God. Now, you may recall I alluded to the fact that that is a non sequitur. I mentioned that we're not, from a Christian perspective, we're not bound to believe either that this is from God or that it's a purely human composition with no supernatural element to it. There is a third option on the table, and Lord willing, towards the end of this presentation, I'm going to unpack what that third option is. So let's get to knowledge of scientific phenomena. So this is what you call, the idea of scientific miracles in the Quran, which is a form of argumentation that is relatively new. It only started becoming popular with the rise of so-called Islamic modernism in the 19th century, but really picked up speed in 1960s and the 1970s with the publication of a book called The Bible, the Quran, and Science, subtitled The Holy Scriptures Examined in Light of Modern Knowledge. I have a copy right here. It's by a French physician named Dr. Maurice Bucaille, and he was, I believe he worked for one of the Saudi princes, I forget which one, but in the course of doing so, he became enamored with Islam. I don't know if he fully converted to it or not. I think he did. Be that as it may, he started publishing books showing how Islam is the true religion, and this is one of his most famous ones. Um, and the basic argument is that the Quran is superior to the Bible because the Bible contains all kinds of scientific errors in it, which the Quran does not have, and the Quran has advanced knowledge of scientific phenomena that would not have been known in the 8th century. This has been picked up and expanded by a variety of other Muslim apologetic works. So I have here a copy of a book called A Brief Illustrated Guide to Understanding Islam. This is a fairly popular book. It was published in 1996. And here in Toronto, all the Dawa groups like to promote this one. I see a copy of this in almost every used bookstore here. So this little book gets around, and a large focus of this book's arguments are on stuff like scientific miracles. So I just want to make some general observations regarding the use of scientific miracles in Islamic apologetics. First of all, one of the things that stands out about this kind of exegesis is that it is distinctly modern in its approach. Those who find scientific miracles in the Quran usually ignore classical exegeses, since the classical commentators wouldn't have been unaware of the scientific phenomena. In fact, as I'm going to show you later on, some of the classical commentators actually promote understandings of the Quran that go against our modern understanding of science. So it would be, so in order to maintain scientific miracles, you kind of have to downplay some of those commentators. Also, most of the Quran verses that are appealed to are of an ambiguous nature. So in the Quran, there are clear verses, and there are also verses that could have more than one meaning. So the vast majority of the time, scientific miracles are being grounded in texts that are capable of being understood in more than one way. And because of that, it's often not immediately obvious that they refer to the phenomena that they're being connected to. Also, there are passages in the Quran that would appear, at least at face value, to contain scientific errors. Now, I need to be careful if I say that. I don't want to say with certainty that they contain scientific errors, but at the very least, a face value reading of these texts would appear to suggest they contain scientific errors. Well, the people who promote scientific miracles will have to apply some hermeneutics to explain or ignore these errors, and in so doing, these apparent errors, mind you, but in so doing, they tend to betray a double standard in their hermeneutic. And this approach is often accompanied by contrast with the Bible, which apologists try to find scientific errors in. So I mentioned Dr. Bukail. He is the archetypal adherent of this approach, and one of my observations when reading the Bible and the Quran in science is that he is not at all fair in his assessment of the Bible. Like, he goes out of his way to find errors in the Bible, including in places where, it's fairly easy to find a way to explain a text in such a way that they don't necessarily have errors. For example, he talks about apparent contradictions in the Bible, and one of the ones he describes is the fact that in Genesis, when it talks about Noah and the flood, one passage talks about two of every animal, whereas another passage talks about 7 pairs of unclean animals, and then he suggests that these two texts contradict each other. But that's not necessarily the case. It could be that the 2 of every animal only applies to the non-clean ones. It's a fairly obvious way of harmonizing the passage, but when your intention is to find errors in the Bible, anything can become a contradiction. Actually, one of the most blatant examples of this is in the section where he talks about the comparative cosmologies of the Quran and the Bible. Now, one of the things you have to note, both the Bible and the Quran talk about creation taking place in 6 days. But Dr. Bukail argues that when the Bible talks about creation being in 6 days, these are obviously 24-hour periods, and they can't mean anything else. Now, if you read the actual section where he talks about this, it's very short. He spends like maybe half a page on this at most, which is not fair because anyone who has delved into the exegesis of Genesis knows that there is a lot involved in trying to unpack what the days of creation could mean. And there is by no means a consensus on whether the days of Genesis are 24-hour periods or longer periods of time, or framework hypothesis, which is one of the more popular explanations these days. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating for any of those viewpoints. What I am saying, though, is that if you're going to assert that the days of Genesis are 24-hour periods, you better have some sort of understanding of the debates that take place even among Christian interpreters on this topic, not just tersely arguing that it's obviously 24-hour periods. But then when he gets to the 6 days in the Quran, he goes out of his way to show that the Quran's days are not 24-hour days, and sometimes the ways he goes about it demonstrate that he's not trying to be fair at all. One of his arguments is that, well, in the Quran it says the day for God is like 1,000 years. Well, we have the exact same passage in the Bible, so why can't the same hermeneutic be used to prove that the Genesis days are not 24-hour periods? Also, Dr. Bukhail stretches the meaning of Quranic texts to make them fit scientific phenomena. For example, one of his arguments is that Big Bang cosmology is anticipated in the Quran, particularly in Surah 21, Ayah 30, where it states the following: "Don't the disbelievers see that the heavens and the earth were joined together, and we separated them, and we made from water everything living, and yet they don't believe?" Now, a plain reading of the verse would not necessarily yield such an interpretation. Instead, you would have to read Big Bang cosmology into the text. There are other ways of explaining this that don't require positing scientific miracles. For example, this could be the result of influence from the text of Genesis, which also uses separation language. Think about the second day of creation, where God separates the waters above the earth from the waters under the earth, and then he separates the waters under the earth. He gathers them into one place to form dry land. So this kind of way of talking about creation is actually commonplace in the ancient Near East. So it's not immediately obvious that the presence of such language in the Quran is evidence of scientific knowledge. And other times, Dr. Bukhail points to certain descriptions of natural phenomena as scientific miracles that could have been knowable to the ancients. For example, he calls it a miracle that the Quran correlates rain clouds with lightning, page 183. In Surah 13, ayahs 12 to 13, it says this: "It is he who shows you the lightning fearfully and hopefully, and raises up the heavy clouds, and the thunder glorifies his praise, and angels from fear him, and he sends the thunderbolts and strikes with it whom he wills, and they dispute with God, and he is mighty in strength." Now, even somebody who does not have today's knowledge of meteorology doesn't have to know modern science to be able to observe that when it gets cloudy, lightning invariably follows. That's fairly common empirical observation. So this is by no means an example of scientific phenomenon. Actually, I have another funny example whenever I see it. There's a Dawa group here in Toronto that sometimes puts ads for scientific miracles on the subway, and one of them was a Quran verse that says, "We have made the sun a burning lamp." Now, I looked at that, thought for 5 seconds, like, are they actually saying that it's a scientific miracle that the Quran says that the sun is hot? I'm like, anyone could go outside and observe that that is the case. You don't need scientific miracles to notice that. Now, one of the most popular examples of scientific miracles is in the area of embryology. And there is a whole chapter, both in Dr. Bukhail's book as well as in this other book dedicated to Quranic embryology. One of the key texts in this regard is Surah 23, ayahs 12 to 14. So this is my English translation. Certain key Arabic words I've placed in the text so that, to draw your attention to them. We made man from an extract of clay. Then we made him into a semen drop, or nutfa, in a firm place. Then we made the semen drop into a blood clot, alaqa. Then we created the blood clot into a chewed substance, mudgha. And then we created for the chewed substance bones. Then we covered the bones with flesh. Then we raised him up as another creation, halqan akhara. And God blessed the best of creation. So notice those two keywords, nutfa, alaqa, mudgha, and khalq akhir. Those are descriptions of what appear to be four distinct stages in the formation of the embryo. And in a brief illustrated guide, there's actually some descriptions of what that means. So here's mentioned the four stages again. Now notice the descriptions are quite vague in and of themselves. Like just reading the text at face value, it's not immediately obvious that there's anything miraculous about the way it's being explained. So apologists have come up with creative comparisons to show how these descriptions are scientifically accurate. So quoting from the brief illustrated guide, and I copy pasted some of their illustrations so that you can see what they have. In the book it says, literally the Arabic word alaqa has three meanings: leech, suspended thing, and blood clot. In comparing a leech to an embryo in the alaqa stage, we find similarity between the two, as we can see in figure 1. Also, the embryo at this stage obtains nourishment from the blood of the mother, similar to the leech, which feeds on the blood of others. The second meaning of the word alaqa is suspended thing. This is what we see in figures 2 and 3. The suspension of the embryo during the alaqa stage in the womb of the mother. So they're saying that because it looks like a leech at this stage, then that's proof that it has a scientifically accurate description. And then goes on to say, the third meaning of the word alaqa is blood clot. This is note that when you find most English translation of the Quran, this is the preferred way of translating the word alaqa. We find that the external appearance of the embryo and its sacs during the alaqa stage is similar to that of a blood clot. This is due to the presence of relatively large amounts of blood present in the embryo during this stage. Also, during this stage, the blood in the embryo does not circulate until the end of the 3rd week. Thus, the embryo at this stage is like a clot of blood. Now, notice that they're saying that there's 3 different shades of meaning for the word alaqa, and the description of the embryo during the first few weeks perfectly matches all of them. And then we get to the 3rd stage, which is the mudgha stage. So it says here that the Arabic word mudgha means chewed substance. If one were, and this is one of my favorite illustrations in the entire book, just so you know. If one were to take a piece of gum and chew it in his or her mouth and then compare it with an embryo at the mudgha stage, we would conclude that the embryo at the mudgha stage is similar in appearance to a chewed substance. This is because of the somites at the back of the embryo that somewhat resemble teeth marks in a chewed substance. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a comparison of the embryo at approximately 4 weeks, and next to it a piece of gum that's been chewed up. And according to the authors of this book, this is proof of the scientific miracle of the description, because the embryo looks like a piece of gum that has been chewed up. So make of that what you will. Now I have some notes on their descriptions. Similarities between the embryo and the leech are actually quite superficial. You kind of have to pick carefully which image you're going to use to make that comparison, because if you find more detailed descriptions of what the embryo actually looks like, see the figure on the upper left, you'll see that it has many details that are different from a leech. Also, although the mother's blood does transport nutrients to the embryo via the placenta, it never travels into the embryo itself. So that kind of weakens the whole leech analogy. The does not derive the it does not take blood directly from the mother. Now, one of the interesting things is that if you're going to take the description as it stands, there's actually a pretty blatant error in it. It talks about the fact that in the mudghah stage, the bones are created and then it is afterwards covered in flesh. Now, this is not correct based on our knowledge of how stem cell differentiation takes place in an embryo. So, for those who have not been paying attention in high school biology class, when the cells in an embryo are dividing in the beginning, they are all stem cells, and they are what you call totipotent embryonic stem cells. That means they have the potential to turn into any other kind of cell. And then over time, these embryonic stem cells will change, and then they will turn into all of the other types of stem cells, such as neurons, red blood cells, white blood cells, bone cells, skin cells, etc. The thing I want to stress is the fact that all of these stem cells differentiate at the same time. It is not the case, as the Quranic text would suggest, that first the bone cells differentiate and then afterwards the skin cells or the muscle cells differentiate. It's all simultaneous. So the most clear description happens to be incorrect. In fact, I have a quote here from the late Nabil Qureshi in his book Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. May he rest in peace. And there's actually an entire chapter in his book where he talks about how when he was still an Ahmadi Muslim, he tried to find evidence for the Quran in scientific miracles. And when he came to the description of the embryonic development, he found that it was not correct. And he pointed to the thing I just mentioned to you, the fact that it appears to show the flesh coming after the bones, where in fact it's actually simultaneous. And Qureshi states in page 234 of his book that this inaccuracy is found in the clearest section of the verse. The easiest to understand only compounds the problem. The first part of the verse requires us to substitute appropriate scientific concepts for the incorrect terms captured by the Arabic. So if we have to fix the first half of the statement and ignore the latter half, what is left to be scientifically miraculous? I then realized that this verse could not defend the inspiration of the Quran. Far from it, we had to assume the inspiration of the Quran to defend this verse. Now, where exactly does the knowledge of embryology found in the Quran come from if it's not miraculous? So contrary to what apologists claim, the embryonic information contained in the Quran was actually known to classical writers. So there has been a lot written on the topic of Quranic embryology and its relationship to Galenic embryology. So this is knowledge of embryology that comes from the classical author Galen. And in fact, in his book De Semine, Galen divides the development of the embryo or the fetus into 4 distinct periods. If you place the description of the 4 periods side by side with the Quranic text, the parallels actually become quite clear. So here's the complete text in pages 92 to 95. Galen says this: "But let's take the account back again to the first conformation of the animal, and in order to make our account orderly and clear, let us divide the creation of the fetus overall into 4 periods of time. The first is that in which, as is seen both in abortions and in dissection, the form of the semen prevails. At this time, Hippocrates too, the all-marvelous, does not yet call the conformation of the animal a fetus. As we heard just now, in the case of semen voided in the sixth day, he still calls it semen. But when it has been filled with blood and heart and brain and liver are still unarticulated and unshaped, and yet have by now a certain solidarity and considerable size, this is the second period. The substance of the fetus has the form of flesh and no longer the form of semen. Accordingly, you would find that Hippocrates too no longer calls such a form semen, but as was said, fetus. The third period follows on this when, as was said, it is possible to see the three ruling parts clearly and a kind of outline, a silhouette as it were, of all the other parts. You'll see the conformation of the three ruling parts more clearly, that of the two parts of the stomach more dimly, and much more still that of the limbs. Later on, they form twigs, as Hippocrates expressed it, indicating by this term their similarity to branches. The fourth and final period is at the stage when all the parts in the limbs have been differentiated. And at this part, Hippocrates, the marvelous, no longer calls the fetus an embryo only, but already a child, too, when he says that it jerks and moves as an animal now fully formed. So notice that there are four stages in Hippocrates/Galen's description of embryology. So let's look at it side by side. The first stage, it is still a semen, and that corresponds perfectly with the first stage in the Quran, the nutfa stage. And then the second stage, Galen says that it's been filled with blood and heart, brain and liver, and they are unarticulated, unshaped. Well, if we take the description of the alaka, that sounds fairly similar. You know, it's filled with blood, so blood clot, and it's unarticulated, unshaped, which makes it fairly looking like a clinging substance. In the third stage, Galen says the third period, it's what you see that there are distinct parts already forming. And in the Quran, it talks about the fact that distinct parts already forming. You have the bones, and then you have the flesh. And then finally, the fourth stage is when all the parts have been fully differentiated. The Quran very generally refers to this as the khalq akhir, and doesn't have as much of a description, but you can see that there is enough similarity between the two that you could plausibly create a link between them. But is it plausible that Muhammad could have known about this? After all, he lived far away from the centers of learning, so how could knowledge of Galenic embryology reach there? As a matter of fact, at least one of Muhammad's companions was a trained physician. So there is a little-known companion named Al-Harith bin Kalada who is said to have studied medicine in the renowned Academy of Gondishapur in Persia. And it's quite plausible that Al-Harith learned Galenic embryology during his time in Gondishapur. And then when he became a Muslim and started following Muhammad, he passed on this knowledge to Muhammad. So we have here a plausible way of explaining the Quranic description of the embryo that doesn't require recourse to the supernatural. Now, I alluded to the fact that there are certain passages in the Quran that appear to have scientific errors in them. So I'm going to try to be a little bit careful with how I go about this. So in Surah 86, ayahs 5 to 7, it says the following: So let man see from what he has created. He is created from ejected fluid, from out between, coming out from between the backbone, a sulb in Arabic, and the ribs, at-tara'ib. Now, this at face value makes it sound like the sperm is actually coming from the man's chest cavity. And Edward Lane, in his Arabic English lexicon, actually goes into detail about what the sulb and the tara'ib refer to. Let's get the ta and the ta mixed up. Anyway, The word solb in classical Arabic refers to the backbone. So that's, the bone extending from the base of the neck to the tailbone. Whereas the tara'ib refers to the two uppermost ribs just below the collar of the neck. So between the sulb and the tara'ib would be somewhere around here, right here. So if we take these two words, tara'ib and a sulb, at face value, it makes it sound like sperm is being produced somewhere here. Now, there is another passage that would be problematic for the proponent of scientific miracles, and that's in Surah 36, Ayah 40, where it says, "The sun is not permitted to overtake the moon, and the night cannot outstrip the day, and everything is gliding in orbit." Now, Dr. Bukhail, in his book, actually attempts to diffuse the potential problematic interpretation of this verse by saying that the sun's orbit that is being talked about is not its orbit around the Earth per se, but its orbit around the center of the galaxy. And he has this lengthy description about the fact that the sun is going at a very incredibly fast speed, revolving around the center of the galaxy. Fair enough. However, if you look at this verse, it presents the sun and the moon as having similar orbits. The sun is said to be not permitted to overtake the moon. If the sun's orbit in question is its orbit around the center of the galaxy, then it would be meaningless to talk about the sun overtaking the moon. This kind of language only makes sense if the moon and the sun have a similar orbit. Now, in Surah 2, Ayah 22, there's a description which says, "He who makes for you the earth a resting place, and the sky a tent canopy, a binat." So here I want to make mention of the fact that you might see in some study Bibles a description of what ancient Hebrew cosmology must have been like, and it always presents the earth like some kind of snow globe. Of course, like it's flat, and then there's like a solid dome on top of it. That's the firmament, or rakia in Hebrew. Interestingly, the Quranic description is somewhat similar to the Genesis description. The word binat here actually means a constructed thing. It has the connotation of a canopy or a tent pavilion. So the idea is that the binat is something solid, which is similar to the rakia that is talked about in Genesis, if we're going to use that sort of cosmological understanding. And then finally, in Surah 88, Ayah 20, this one, you actually have to look at some of the commentators for this one. It says, "Do they not look towards the earth, how it is laid out flat?" Or sutihat in Arabic. Now, the text itself doesn't appear problematic. It's when you start looking at what commentators have said about it that does become problematic. So there's the two Jalals, Jalaluddin As-Suyuti, and I forgot who the other Jalal is, but they're collectively known as Al-Jalalain, and they wrote this commentary, which is very popular in the Sunni Muslim world. And in Al-Jalalain's commentary on this verse, it says the following: As for his words, Sutihat, laid out flat, this, on a literal reading, suggests that the earth is flat, which is the opinion of most of the scholars of the revealed law, and not a sphere, as astronomers al-Hayya have it, even if this latter does not contradict any of the pillars of the law. So it was already known in the 16th century, which is when the two Jalals wrote that the earth was spherical, and he mentions that this appears at face value to go against received knowledge. It gets more interesting. If you look at Ibn Kathir in his famous tafsir, in some of his descriptions, he talks about the earth on the back of a great fish. So particularly in Surah 68, it's the one that begins with the letter Nun, And then he talks about what the meaning of the mysterious letter Nun is in the beginning of the surah. And now, if you look at the common English version of Ibn Kathir's tafsir that's floating around on the internet, you're not going to find this. It's been left out, but it is in the Arabic text. So I have here the Arabic text of Ibn Kathir tafsir, and have a translation of it for the benefit of those who can't read Arabic. And here in the first part says, ثم خلق نون ورفع بخار الماء ففتقت منه السماء وبسطت الأرض على ظهر نون. So in English, then he created the Nun and caused the steam of the water to rise, and the heaven was made from it, and the earth was placed upon the back of the Nun. The Nun is actually a great fish in Arabic belief. So notice the letter Nun, circling it right here. It vaguely resembles a fish. You kind of have to be creative if you squint at it. And you can see, the dot above the Nun. I guess you can imagine how that dot could be representing the earth. And then later on, he reiterates it. ثم خلق نون فوق الماء ثم كبس الأرض عليه. Then he created the Nun above the water. Then he pressed the earth upon it. Kabasa is a fairly forceful language. It's like pressing down the earth onto the back of this giant Nun fish. Now, I'm not saying that you necessarily have to believe that the Quran has scientific errors. The way that I presented the text to you is just presenting one possible way of understanding the text. And you could read the text in such a way that doesn't necessarily yield such errors. However, if we go by the interpretive method used by proponents of scientific miracles, such as Dr. Bukhail and the authors of A Brief Illustrated Guide, then the kinds of descriptions I just mentioned to you would actually be fair game. It's based on the exact same hermeneutic as the one they're employing. In some cases, it's actually more faithful to classical exegesis, because as you can see in Al-Jalalain, Ibn Kathir, they actually do present the text that way. And to claim otherwise would be to engage in double standards. This actually troubled the late Qureshi. Again, going back to his book, he talks about the problems with this method of argumentation. And he states, believing that it was impossible for the Quran to say something so obviously incorrect, I began looking online for answers. Once again, I found a similar procedure to defend the verse. Redefine the words and gloss over the difficulties. And that was the pattern that emerged. Whether proclaiming scientific miracles or defending scientific inaccuracies, the protocol always called for redefining the clear statements of the Quran to say something they did not say and then glossing over any strain. After I recognized the pattern, it struck me that Bukhailism was very much like studying the life of Muhammad. I could defend my Islamic beliefs if I approached the issue as a partisan Muslim willing to redefine certain terms and emphasize certain points in favor of my position. But if I tried to build a case as an objective investigator, reading the text at face value, there simply was no scientifically miraculous knowledge in the Quran. So much for that. Now let's look at the second argument that on our list, which is knowledge of future events. And really, if you look at the Quran, there isn't much in the way of prophecies, other than maybe prophecies about the last day. But there is one that Muslim apologists love to talk about, and that's the one in Surah Rum. That's Surah 30, in ayat 2-4. It says here, the Romans have been defeated in the land close by, but after their defeat, they will conquer in a few years. In the Arabic, it says, fi bid'i sinin. To God is the matter from before and after, and on that day the believers will rejoice. So the victory of the Romans is actually presented here as something that the Muslims will rejoice in. Now, the word bid is a little vague. Most commentators and Arabic grammarians are of the opinion that bid refers to a period of approximately 3 to 9 years. So the idea is that from when this prophecy was made, it had 9 years to be fulfilled, and according to most apologists, there was in fact a victory that took place within that time period for the Romans. So, in the brief illustrated guide, it says here on page 36, the Roman army was badly defeated at Antioch in 613, and as a result, the Persians swiftly pushed forward on all fronts. At the time, it was hard to imagine that the Romans would defeat the Persians, but the Quran foretold that the Romans would be victorious within 3 to 9 years. In 622, 9 years after the Romans' defeat, the two forces, Romans and Persians, met on Armenian soil, and the result was the decisive victory of the Romans over the Persians for the first time after the Romans' defeat in 613. The prophecy was fulfilled just as God had said in the Quran. So, sounds impressive? Well, let's think a little bit about what exactly is being said here. Now, how do we assess prophecy? Now, first thing to note, prophets must have a 100% success rate in predicting the future. If someone claims to be a prophet, makes 10 prophecies, and they get 9 out of 10 correct, well, guess what? The one that they got wrong will disqualify them from being a prophet. This is actually stated in the Bible, Deuteronomy 18, verse 21-22. I don't think that any Muslim would, in principle, object to this. They would agree that a prophet must have a perfect record. Now, that's not the only thing. In order for a prophecy to be meaningfully verifiable or falsifiable, it should be detailed. So the more detailed the prophecy is, the easier it is to verify or falsify. And the reason why I mentioned this is that the more vague prophecy is, the easier it is to find something to fill it. So it has to be something that is detailed, but it's also something that should be improbable. So if I mention something that's fairly probably going to happen, just by sheer chance, there's a pretty good chance it will happen. So because of that, general and probable statements about the future are not meaningful as prophecies. If I said right now, there will be a cloudy day in Toronto sometime next week, that's not a very good prophecy because we get cloudy days all the time. In fact, it's cloudy right now. Did not expect that when I was writing this. So there you go. I just fulfilled my own prophecy. Now, even if, say, someone made a detailed and improbable prediction and comes to pass, that doesn't necessarily mean that prophecy is involved. People have been known to correctly predict improbable events from time to time. I was trying to think of an example for this. The one that came to mind is in the world of stock market news. I don't know if anyone pays attention to stock market news. I do from time to time. Around early 2018, there was this well-known fund manager named Catherine Wood, CEO of ARK Invest, and she made an interesting prediction in CNBC. She said that Tesla shares will hit $4,000. At the time, it was trading for around $300. Now, it so happened there's a stock split in between then and now, so the current prices don't reflect what the value was. So $4,000 pre-split would be $800 now. If you go on Google and look up the current stock price of Tesla, it is hovering at a little over $800, which in pre-split terms would be above $4,000. So this is actually fairly noteworthy when it happened because everyone thought she was crazy. There's no way Elon Musk's company was going to explode the way it did. Take a look at the chart, right? For all of 2018 and 2019, Tesla was a loser. If you were investing in Tesla, you would not have been making any money. Around the time of the pandemic, Tesla exploded, and Tesla stock price hit that $4,000+ mark around early 2021, and it's been hovering more or less at that point ever since. So is Cathie Wood a prophet? Some of his investors probably think so. But this is just to show you that even in the mundane realm of something like stock market investing, a person can make an improbable prediction and it'll come true. So, can we come up with a prediction that is roughly analogous to the one in Certa Room in terms of its probability? So, here's one that I came up with, and let's see how closely we can mirror that prediction. As you all remember, back in 2020, in the in the very contentious general election, Biden became the president, and the Democrats took control of the House of Representatives. Now, suppose that at the time I'd made the following prediction: the Republicans had been defeated in the 2020 House race, but afterwards they will triumph in another race within 3 to 9 years. So notice that I deliberately tried to closely mirror the prophecy in Certa Room. So I think it would be fair to say that the two predictions are roughly equal in probability. When it comes to, you have two major parties to mirror the two sides that were fighting each other in a war. So there's an equal probability of either one winning at any given point. And also there are 4 races happening within the next 9 years after 2020. So there's one happening this year, and then one in 2024, and another 26 and 128. So there's 4 opportunities for my prophecy of the Republicans gaining back the House of Representatives to either come true or not. So let's come back to this video in a few years and see if my prophecy has come to pass. Of course, I'm not saying it's perfect probability. I believe the Republicans held the House between 1994 and 2006, so it's quite possible for the Democrats to hold the House for 12 years at a time, in which case this prediction could be falsified. But it is to make the point that you could make a prophecy about an event in the political and military sphere, or prediction, and then it could come to pass. But it is conceivable at a purely human level to do that without the aid of the supernatural. Now, I mentioned that a prophecy, in order for it to be meaningful as a prophecy, has to be very detailed and has to mention improbable events. So I want to point to an analogous prophecy that was made by another would-be prophet claimant, and that is the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith. I remember when I was talking with some LDS missionaries around the early stages of the pandemic, I asked the missionary I was talking to, do you have any evidence to show me that Joseph Smith is a prophet of God? And he told me to read Doctrine and Covenants 87 in the LDS scriptures. This was Joseph Smith predicting this American Civil War in December 25th, 1832. That's almost 30 years before it happened. And in Joseph Smith's prophecy, he states the following: Verily, thus saith the Lord, concerning the wars that will shortly come to pass, beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina, which will eventually terminate in the death and misery of many souls. And the time will come that war will be poured out upon all nations, beginning at this place. For behold, the southern states shall be divided against the northern states, and the southern states will call on other nations, even the nation of Great Britain, as it is called, and they shall also call upon other nations in order to defend themselves against other nations, and then war shall be poured out upon all nations. It goes on. It shall come to pass after many days, slaves shall rise up against their masters, who shall be marshaled and disciplined for war. And it shall come to pass also that the remnants who are left of the land will marshal themselves, and shall become exceedingly angry, and shall vex the Gentiles with a sore vexation. And thus with the sword and by bloodshed the inhabitants of the earth shall mourn, and with famine and plague and earthquake and the thunder of heaven. And the fierce and vivid lightning also shall the inhabitants of the earth be made to feel the wrath and indignation and chastening hand of an almighty God, until the consumption decree hath made a full end of all nations. So what does Joseph Smith get right and what does he get wrong? It's actually quite impressive how much this prediction gets right. Even for someone who does not believe that the Mormon prophet is from God, um, how did he figure out that the Civil War would start in South Carolina? We know that the first battle in the Civil War, depending on who you ask, is either the Battle of Fort Sumter or the First Battle of Bull Run. Either way, both of them happened in the state of South Carolina in 1861. A little bit harder, trickier would be the mention of the slave revolt, but one could conceivably say that this is a reference to John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which took place just before the Civil War in 1859. And the southern states would call on the other nations for help, specifically Great Britain. It's actually a matter of fact that in this American Civil War, the Confederacy tried to get Great Britain on their side, and Great Britain did do some things to assist the Confederacy, like building them a battleship and allowing Confederates to conduct raids on Union territories from Canada. So, the amount that Smith gets right is actually quite impressive. But he does not get everything right. He states that the war would spread from the states to all other nations of the world. Now, LDS apologists will say, oh, that's a reference to the two world wars. But the way it's presented in the prophecy makes it sound like it's all one war. The two world wars did not follow from the Civil War. If it did, then they would be bang on, but that's not the case. It also said that the wrath of God would make an end of all the nations. So there's talk about famines and earthquakes and stuff. Obviously, an end of the nations has not taken place as a result of this war, so Smith gets that one wrong as well. So, what can we say about this prediction? It's certainly a lot more detailed than the prediction in Surah Rum. And because it's more detailed, that means there are more opportunities for Smith to get details right, but also more opportunities to get details wrong. And as I mentioned before, in order to be a prophet, you have to have a 100% success rate, and Smith does not get 100%, so he's disqualified. Nevertheless, even if he doesn't get a perfect score, the fact that he got correctly the state where the war would begin and the fact that there would be a slave revolt actually is pretty impressive. It's certainly more detailed. It's certainly more impressive than the saying that, oh, the Romans lost a battle, but later on they're going to win one. So, what my conclusion regarding Surah 30, ayat 2 to 4, the prediction made in that passage is not specific or improbable enough to prove that it is the result of prophecy from God. And it is quite plausible for an ordinary person to have made the same prediction correctly without divine inspiration. So even a purely mundane realm, such a correct prediction is comprehensible. Now let's get to the third argument, which is the knowledge of biblical lore. So what do I mean when I say biblical lore? Because if you look at, the Quran, it does have stories about biblical characters, and sometimes it's the same as what's in the Bible, sometimes it's different from what's in the Bible. When I talk about biblical lore, I don't just mean the actual Bible stories, but I'm also referring to Jewish and Christian traditions regarding biblical characters. So, for example, the story of Abraham smashing his father's idols, that's not in the Bible, but it is in the Jewish Midrashim, as seen, for example, in Louis Ginzberg's Legend of the Jews. So there is a parallel between the rabbinic story and the Quranic story. It's not just biblical characters either. We could expand the idea of biblical lore to encompass non-biblical characters who are nevertheless well known in Jewish or Christian tradition. This would include such famous figures as Alexander the Great, known in the Quran as Dhul Qarnayn, the ancient Near Eastern Ahikar the Sage, known in the Quran as Luqman, and the seven sleepers of Ephesus, whose story is recounted in Surah Al-Kahf. Now, according to Muslim apologists, the fact that these stories appear in the Quran is actually evidence of its divine origin, because Muhammad could not have known such stories given his background. Muhammad was unlettered. He was the Ummi prophet, as the Quran puts it. And nobody among the Quraysh would have known these stories either. So if Muhammad didn't know it, nobody in the Quraysh know it. Where does the Quran get this story from? According to apologists, must have been from God. And they appeal to a certain verse in the Quran in connection to this. This is in Surah Hud, that's chapter 11, ayah 49, where it says, "That is a message of the unseen. We reveal it to you. You didn't know it, you nor your people from before this, so be patient. Truly, the end is for the God-fearing." Actually, for context, Surah Hud contains the story of Noah and the flood. So right after recounting the Noah story, this verse appears saying that, so according to apologists, this is indication that prior to this, Muhammad did not know about the story of Noah, and his people didn't either. However, there's some problems with that interpretation. Now, this could not be taken as an absolute declaration of lack of knowledge of the Noah story, for the simple reason that if you look at certain surahs that are earlier than Surah Hud, the Noah story appears in them. So if you look at a standard traditional list of when the surahs were revealed, two of the surahs that come before Surah Hud are Al-Isra, that's number 17, and Ash-Shu'ara, Shu'ara, that's 26. So these both contain the Noah story, and they're prior to Surah Hud. So obviously, even prior to revealing of Surah Hud, the Noah story was known to Muhammad. And not only that, there's another way of understanding Surah 11, Ayah 49. It could be understood to be referring to a deeper spiritual message of the stories. So in the Arabic, it talks about the message of the unseen, Anba al-Ghaib. So this could be a reference to the spiritual message of the Noah story. So instead of the story itself being unknown, it could be that the spiritual message of the story was unknown. And in fact, this is the approach taken by a number of Muslim commentators, such as Syed Hussein Nasser and the other editors of the Study Quran. Have it over here. If you go to page 576 of the Study Quran, where he comments on Surah 1149, it states this: "Given the presence of Christians and Jews in Mecca during the lifetime of the Prophet, it is more likely that this verse refers to a lack of knowledge about the details and spiritual meaning of such stories, rather than a general lack of knowledge of them." Now, how much biblical lore did exist in pre-Islamic Arabia? So for this, I'd like to refer the reader to Nikolai Sinai, who wrote a book called The Quran, a Historical Critical Introduction. There's a bunch of other books on this as well, such as Robert Hoyland's Arabia and the Arabs Before Islam, as well as Sidney Griffith, The Arabic Bible. So I would refer the reader to those two books as well. But for simplicity, I'm only going to refer to Sinai's book. So in the third chapter of the book, he talks about the Quranic milieu. And he talks about the fact that there were actually many Arabs, even before Islam, who knew biblical stories. So he states, and I quote, "Despite Arabia's increasing political and cultural integration into the late antique world, the majority of the peninsula's inhabitants would still have been nominally pagan, that is, not Jewish or Christian, in the early 600s. This is actually an explanatory merit of the traditional placement of the Quran's Genesis, for as was pointed out above, the text presupposes deities and sacrificial rites that would be surprising in a predominantly Christian setting. Yet, we also saw that the Quran's audience must have been aware of a wide range of biblical and parabiblical traditions." And then Sinai goes on to say, and I quote, "In attempting to reconcile these two givens, it may be a mistake to imagine the Quranic milieu as one in which two clearly demarcated groups, native pagans on the one hand and Jews and Christians on the other, confronted each other in tidy separation. Instead, Arabian pagans may have fused biblical and Christian traditions with more ancient and indigenous forms of belief and worship. The possibility of such syncretism entails that in the Quran's milieu of origin, Jewish and Christian traditions and ideas may not have been the exclusive preserve of self-confessing Jews and Christians, but could have reverberated in wider pagan circles. And in fact, we have hints of this in the Islamic tradition. It was said, for example, that certain images of biblical characters were found in the Kaaba before it was cleansed by Muhammad. Again, Sinai writes, and I quote, "It stands to reason, then, that the Quranic associators, the mushrikeen, worshipped ancient Arabian deities, yet felt free to reinterpret and supplement their ancestral rites by concepts and ideas adopted from the Jewish and Christian traditions that were increasingly seeping into the Arabian interior. The associators may even have appropriated elements of Christian ritual practice. According to later Islamic sources, when Mecca surrendered to Muhammad, the Kaaba was adorned with icon-like images, namely, a picture of Abraham as an old man and performing divination by the shaking of arrows, and a picture of Jesus, son of Mary, and his mother, and a picture of angels. So, if this tradition is accurate, that means Abraham and Jesus' stories were known to the Meccans, even before Islam. And in fact, even if we were to discount this and assume that indeed the Quraysh did not know about the biblical stories, Muhammad did not necessarily need to have picked up biblical stories or biblical lore from his fellow Quraysh. He could have picked it up from Christians traveling the region. In fact, if you look at the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham, it talks about numerous encounters with Christians, both before his prophetic career and during his early stages. And the page numbers are taken from the Oxford University Press edition, which is the standard English translation you'll find in most places. So first you have the encounter with some Abyssinian Christians when he was still a young boy. And then a little bit later, talks about his encounter with the monk Bahira, who supposedly looked at his back and saw the marks of prophecy on it. And then there is his encounter with Waraq ibn Nawfal, who is well known from the hadith in Sahih Bukhari, where Khadija takes Muhammad to Waraqah, and Waraqah is a Christian because he has a copy of the gospel with him, and Waraqah is the one that tells Muhammad that he's a prophet. And then there's Salman al-Farisi, who was a Zoroastrian who became a Christian, and then he joined Muhammad and became a Muslim. And this took place early in Muhammad's prophetic career. And then he encountered a group of 20 Abyssinian Christians who identified Muhammad as a prophet and accepted Islam. And all of the encounters that I mentioned here chronologically precede the sending down of Surah Hud. So prior to Surah Hud being revealed, we have 5 instances of Muhammad encountering Christians. Any one of these could have been a source of the Noah story, among other biblical stories that are recounted in the Quran. So based on the aforementioned data, it is quite plausible that at least some among the pagan Quraysh knew some biblical lore. Some even incorporated biblical characters into their worship practices. Muhammad could also have learned biblical lore directly from his early encounters with Christians. In any case, it is unnecessary to posit that the Quran's knowledge of such lore came from the supernatural. So as we see, none of the instances of supernatural knowledge, as they're claimed, actually necessitate a supernatural explanation. There are plausible natural explanations for all the things that the Muslim apologists try to present. Now, I have an epilogue to this presentation, which revisits the question: is the Quran supernatural? Are we left with the explanation that, oh, it's purely a natural man-made composition. You know, just because the following things I've just mentioned don't prove some sort of supernatural um, guidance doesn't mean that there isn't one. Now, I want to recap the very beginning of part one of the presentation. I visited the question, if the Quran is not from God, how did it come about? If you are non-religious, you don't believe in God or the supernatural, you would probably say that, well, whatever explanation exists for the composition of the Quran would have to be a purely natural phenomenon. There's no God or angel or spirit responsible for creating the text. Now, on the flip side, if you are a theist of some sort, such as a Jew or a Christian or a Zoroastrian or whatever else, you could say that there is some sort of spirit behind the production of the Quran, some sort of angel or spirit. But what we would not be able to affirm is that whatever supernatural being is behind the composition is from God. In the Bible, it talks about various spirits, fallen angels, etc., that are operative in the world, but they are operating independently of God's plans for the world, and may in some cases be acting at cross purposes with God's plans. So, from a Christian or a Jewish perspective, that is one possible way of explaining how the Quran could have come about. Now, is there any evidence that the Quran has some sort of supernatural element to it? I think there probably is. So there are hints of supernatural influence guiding Muhammad in the production of the Quran. And I base this on 3 points. The first point is that Muhammad sincerely believed he was a prophet. The second point is that he recited revelations while in a state of ecstasy. And then the third point is that these recitations cannot be explained by any merely natural phenomenon. So let's look at the first point. Muhammad sincerely believed he was a prophet. Now, I know a lot of non-Muslims who will object to this. I have heard it said that Muhammad knew he was not a prophet. He deliberately pretended to be a prophet for the political gain. However, I don't think that is plausible. Surely, towards the end of his life, the nascent Muslim community did gain some political influence, but that was not the case during most of the early period of Muhammad's prophetic ministry. Look at the Meccan period. Muhammad and the Muslims were in the minority. Most of the people in Mecca were against him. He got strident opposition. He got mockery. He was harassed. At some points, he was threatened with death. Now, if he was a self-conscious charlatan, why would he expose himself to all this mockery and threat of death? He would not have weathered such opposition had he been deceiving himself or others that he was a prophet. So I would conclude that Muhammad's willingness to face persecution points to his sincerity. He really thought he was a prophet. Now, the second point is that he recited revelations while in a state of ecstasy. This is well known in the Muslim tradition. So in Sahih al-Bukhari, in the second hadith, it actually has this little interesting anecdote about what it's like when Muhammad receives revelation. Al-Harith bin Hisham asked Allah's Messenger, "O Allah's Messenger, how is the divine inspiration revealed to you?" Allah's Messenger replied, "Sometimes it is like the ringing of a bell. This form of inspiration is the hardest of all, and then this state passes off after I've grasped what is inspired. Sometimes the angel comes in the form of a man and talks to me, and I grasp whatever he says." Aisha added, "Verily, I saw the Prophet being inspired divinely on a very cold day, and noticed the sweat dropping from his forehead." So you can see that Muhammad sometimes has a state of ecstasy where he would hear things, he would see an angel, and this would be the occasion of him receiving the recitations, which leads me to point number three. These recitations cannot be explained by any merely natural phenomenon. So some of my non-theistic colleagues are going to disagree with me on this. Um, so there are a number of ways of trying to explain how these recitations can come about naturally, and one of the most popular ones that I've seen is that Muhammad was some sort of epileptic. He had seizures, and these seizures are what are being described in the anecdotes that I just showed you. However, I don't think this is a good explanation. Um, Now, I've not met that many epileptics throughout my lifetime, but I do know one thing. Epileptics generally do not start spontaneously begin reciting religious texts. You know, that's a common misconception. Now, if you look at the ecstatic experiences Muhammad describes, it doesn't match the description of an epileptic seizure. If you don't have him shaking violently on the ground the way an epileptic would. However, there is something that is similar to Muhammad's experience. If you look at pre-Islamic Arabia, there are stories of seers and poets who supposedly received inspiration from jinns. So this is part of the pre-Islamic Arabian religion, and for this, I'm referring to the study of Tor Andre in his book Muhammad, the Man and His Faith. And he talks about the religious fervor of pre-Islamic Arabia. So on the screen, I have a short version of the quote. I just want to recite the full unabridged paragraph on page 29, where he says, there was a certain guild of seers whose members received their esoteric knowledge from a spirit, a genie, or as Muhammad described it in less friendly terms, from Satan. It was said that the seer, Kahin, was Majnun, that is, possessed by jinni. But in Muhammad's day, we find that the relation of the seer to the spirit is no longer thought of as possession. It is a personal fellowship in which the jinni tells his friend what he knows. According to Muhammad's conception, a jinni attempts to get hold of what has been transacted among the heavenly beings and what has been written upon the heavenly tablets, and then cackles it into the ear of his friend as a hen cackles. But when the Quran was revealed to Muhammad, angels were stationed to guard heaven, and whenever they discovered one of these jinn listening, they hurled a flaming meteor at him and killed him. And like the seer, the poet was also inspired by a spirit, a jinni. At the beginning of his career, a poet occasionally met his muse, who used physical force to make him the poet of his tribe. One day, Hassan bin Thabit was walking through a street in Medina. A female spirit pressed him down, kneeling upon his chest, and said, "Are you the man whom your people expect to become their poet?" Then she forced him to utter 3 verses, and Hassan, who had never been able to compose before, became a poet. He was in a real sense musoleptos, possessed by the muse. So actually, the story of Hassan bin Thabit is very interesting because of how similar it sounds to Muhammad's initial encounter with the angel Gabriel in the cave of Hira, where the angel forces him to recite the words of Surah 96. So based on the similarity in description between the experiences of pre-Islamic seers and poets and that of Muhammad, it's reasonable to suppose that a supernatural being of some sort was guiding Muhammad in the production of the Quran. In fact, didn't put it in the slides, but in the Quran it does talk about how the Quraysh perceived Muhammad to be Majnun. So the fact that Muhammad was perceived to be Majnun would imply that Muhammad's experience was similar to what they knew of the experiences of pre-Islamic seers. The supernatural guidance doesn't necessarily exclude concepts from Muhammad's own mind, be included into the text of the Quran. So, as I mentioned, everything that we have examined in the Quran in terms of knowledge could conceivably have come from Muhammad's knowledge. Um, it could be a combination of supernatural guidance and natural knowledge. Now, whether the being in question is from God or not, that is the matter of debate between Muslims and non Muslim theists. So that is where I leave off the presentation. So the arguments that we've examined do not prove that the Quran is from God. And I think that we could find natural explanations for all of those arguments. I hope that you guys found that very helpful. Now, I wonder if Michael's still here, because if so, perhaps there are some people.
All right, let's see. Well, I do have comments, but no questions offhand. Well, here's one.
Yeah, that one's I go back and forth on this one. Are the hadith to be taken seriously? And honestly, like, I'm of two minds of this. On the one hand, clearly the Muslims had what you would call the best way to describe it is a culture of verification. So you're familiar with the fact that in hadith studies they have the isnad, which is the chain of narrators, going all the way back to the original reciter, and you want to make sure that there are no breaks in the chain. Everyone in the list must have conceivably heard from the person.
How can I verify that? I mean, I can write a list right now going back to Jesus.
Well,
how can I verify?
Yeah, that's actually one of the criticisms of that approach, because I believe Jonathan Brown talks about this, how sometimes it's not just the actual text of the hadith that is forged, but the isnad going along with it. And there's at least one instance of somebody being caught in the act, because there's this story of a hadith being narrated by this one guy, and he recites the chain of narrators, and it just so happens that one of the narrators on the list was in the circle at the time that it was being said, and he stood up and said, "I never narrated such a thing." So we have at least one confirmed instance of someone making up an isnad. So it is possible. What a Muslim would say in response to that is that you also have to look at the character of the narrators. You have to make sure that these are not the sorts of people who would make stuff up. So,
but I don't know that they actually said it. That's the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, I can make up a whole bunch of virtuous people from now all the way back to Jesus. That doesn't mean they were actually real people who said this.
Yeah, how a Muslim would say that is they would ask, well, are you trustworthy? Like, do we know that you are someone who's I'm
not trying to establish the argument. I'm not trying to. I'm not the one making the claim.
I
could be the worst person in the world. I'm not trying to. But
I'm just trying to play devil's advocate.
You're saying if I were to write a list, if you're saying if I were to write a list,
yeah.
But I mean, again,
so
I don't know.
There are debates among Muslims as to the authenticity, how much of the hadith corpus is actually authentic. So there's two collections, Bukhari and Muslim, that are widely considered the most authentic among Sunni Muslims. So you notice I quoted a couple times from Bukhari. And the reason I quote from Bukhari is, among the vast majority of Muslims, he's the most trustworthy. But of course, even Bukhari gets stuff wrong. In fact, there's a guy on YouTube, Mufti Abu Layth. Conservative Muslims hate him because he's something of a modernist. But he has a bunch of videos. There's a two-parter on Sahih al-Bukhari and how it's not as sahih as traditional Muslims make it out to be. There's like a hashtag Bukharigate if you want to look it up, and he talks about the fact that there are flaws in the methodology of Bukhari, and not everyone, even in his day, considered his work to be reliable. But if anyone's interested, I would suggest looking up Mufti Abu Layth's videos on this topic.
Okay. I had an initial question from the last century. Do serious Muslims make the argument from beauty, or is that more of a popular level argument?
It's very hard to. Okay, so actually, it does appear in the works of scholarly Muslims. So Abu Sulaiman al-Khattabi is one example that I mentioned, and Naveed Kermani. He has a whole scholarly monograph on this argument. So it is something that serious Muslims make, and it's hard for a Muslim not to take it seriously because the Quran makes the argument itself. So, it is a fairly popular argument in that way.
Islamic tradition trashes Ibn al-Kalbi, but historical scholarship vindicates him. Who's to be trusted as to trustworthiness here?
Yeah, so Al-Kalbi, the people who take his opinion the most seriously are generally people of a more Hanbali or Salafi bent. So for those who are not familiar, go to sunnah.com. You might notice that whenever you look at the hadith there's a grading. Wait, am I thinking about Kalbi, or was I thinking of some other guy? I believe I'm thinking of the right person. Sorry, that's Albani. Why did I get those two people mixed up? Oh yeah, Al-Kalbi. That's the one who wrote Tanwir al-Mikbas. The Ibn al-Kalbi that I know of wrote a Quran commentary, and it's been attributed to Ibn Abbas. But it's been shown that Tanwir al-Mikbas is actually the work of Ibn al-Kalbi. So that, because of that, he is, that's as much as I know about his work. Also, his book, his name literally means the dog guy. Like, Kalb means dog in Arabic. So the fact that he has a nickname, the dog dude, does not say much about how he was perceived by his peers.
Would you recommend Gordon Nichols' The Quran and Christian Commentary and Robert Spencer's The Critical Quran as decent editions?
I'm a little leery of promoting Spencer's work. However, I will say this about Gordon Nickel. I actually do have correspondence with Dr. Nickel, so I consider him a friend and a colleague. And he actually gave me a copy of the very book in question. Here it is, the Quran with Christian Commentary. I actually wrote a review for it, and I think it's a good book. Obviously, I would not recommend that a Muslim read it, but it has two things going for it. One is the fact that it uses A.J. Droge's translation, which is actually a very literal translation of the Arabic text, much more form equivalent than most other translations. So when you read this, you actually get a good idea of what the Arabic feels like relative to most other translations. The other nice thing about this is that the commentaries, the footnotes, as well as the articles on the book, I'll show it here, are all geared towards Christian-Muslim dialogue. It points to topics that are of interest to Christians, and it talks about similarities or parallels between the Bible and the Quran. And I see a reference here to Gabriel Side Reynolds, The Quran, the Bible. Actually, Nickel's work and Reynolds' work, they're actually very similar. They have the same general methodology. So although I would think Reynolds' work is probably considered more respectable in academic circles, Gordon Nickel, he is an academic, but he also has a reputation for being a missionary and apologist. So I find that when talking to Muslims as well as academics in Islamic studies, they are a little bit suspicious of him. Um, so if you know, Dr. Nikel is probably listening. So I do enjoy his work, but I think if you're trying to quote something to a Muslim, they're more likely to take it seriously if you're quoting Reynolds.
A Christian could explain Genesis inaccuracies by appeal to genre. Obviously, this wouldn't work for the Quran. So, how do they reconcile this?
Well, you know, they would. There's two that I could think of. One is what you call an allegorical approach. So all these descriptions, they're metaphors or allegories. The other one would be a phenomenological approach. So the Quran is describing things the way it would be perceived by the one viewing it. So it's like I'll give you an example from the Bible. Okay, was Jonah swallowed by a whale or a fish? Well, literally, the text says, you know, a fish, a giant fish, but everybody thinks it's a whale, even though whales are not fish. So what gives? Well, the Hebrews did not have a word for whale, and the closest thing to a whale in their, you know, from their perspective would be a fish. So they would describe the whale as a big fish. It's probably the same case with a lot of these apparent inaccuracies in the Quran. A Muslim apologist could explain them as what the phenomenon appears to be from the reader's perspective.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's everything, right? All of them.
There's a one that I think we missed. Let me see. Considering Phlebas says, do we even know that Muhammad is the source of the Quran? It's an anonymous collection of texts. Well, you know, I'm agnostic on this. I will not say that we know for sure that Muhammad wrote all of it, and I wouldn't necessarily rule out either. Like, I could believe that Muhammad wrote all of it, or at least recited all of it. Other people obviously wrote it for him. Now, I mentioned Dr. Sinai's book on the Quran. He does have a section there on possible post-Muhammadan additions to the Quran. That is to say, parts of the Quran that could have been written after Muhammad's death. Now, his reasoning is kind of creative. I'm not sure that I agree with his conclusions, but I mentioned this to make note of the fact that it is an opinion that at least some critical scholars of the Quran would take. Now, when I'm talking to a Muslim, I generally do not resort to such theories. I will assume, for the sake of argument, that Muhammad did indeed produce the entire Quran, or he recited all of it. It's not inherently implausible, in my opinion, that he could have done that. So I'm just gonna, in discussions, take it at face value.
Fair enough. All right. Given your criteria you mentioned for prophecies regarding predictions, don't basically all biblical prophecies fail that criteria?
Oh, I don't think all of them fail the criteria. Like being born in Bethlehem is fairly precise, you'd say. That's in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Plus, I believe there's one person who did a study of it. I had to go back to my notes, but somebody went through a combination of these prophecies and asked, what are the odds that a single individual could fulfill all of these prophecies by chance? So, being born in Bethlehem, being pierced, etc. And the conclusion was the probability that it could be fulfilled by chance is very infinitesimally small. The analogy that I always like to use is that imagine that you filled the entire state of Texas knee deep in pennies. You mark up a single penny, toss it in the pile, blindfold someone and ask them to pick up a penny. What are the odds that that person is going to pick up the correct marked up penny on the very first try? So that is actually the probability of a single person fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies regarding the Messiah.
Awesome. Anything that you wanted to make the viewers aware of? Put in a plug for something?
Yeah. So we have an Ahmadi missionary who's gonna be, who I've been talking to. His name is Farhan Iqbal. He's considered something of a scholar in his community. So we're gonna have a Catholic Ahmadi dialogue later this month here on Reason and Theology. So we've seen that Islam is not a monolith. Most of the Muslim apologists that we run into tend to be of the Sunni variety, but we have people like Dr. Andani as well, who's an Ismaili. And now we're going to have an Ahmadi on the show. Now, I know a lot of Sunnis and Shiis don't consider them Muslims. They think that they're, the best analogy is they're kind of like the Mormons from Christian perspective, but be that as it may, the Ahmadis are putting themselves out there, and if they want to dialogue, I have no reason to say no to them.
Yeah, excellent. I look forward to that as well. Everybody hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. Also go and check out part 1 to this one. It's the same title as this video. It's going to be Examining Muslim Arguments for the Quran part 1 with Louis Dizon. So make sure to check that out if you haven't seen it already. All right, we'll see y'all later. God bless. Oh wait, before you go, I would really appreciate it if you would consider supporting this channel. This is my primary means to provide for my family, and it also helps me to produce content like this video. If you would like to support me, become a patron by visiting patreon.com/Reason and Theology. You'll also get access to extra exclusive content when you become a patron. Lastly, hit that like button and the subscribe button, and be sure to leave a comment down below. God bless.